Greetings, students. Welcome to CompleityFuel. My name is Mr. Little, and today I'm looking at this really beautiful piece of artwork from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It's believed to have come from either Iran or Central Asia. And it's described as a man clutching the hem of his beloved. But there's a little bit more to this painting than meets the eye. Described as the embodiment of what many Sufi orders in the Islamic religion believe. If we take this painting as an analogy for the Sufi desire to be one with God or one with Allah. The Sufis want to be one with God, and this desire, this desired intimacy, is so fleeting and difficult to attain. It is as though it is a lover holding the hem of his beloved. And this theme of wanting to be one with God or one with the divine in the way that one might be with someone they love is prevalent in Sufism, but it's also of other religious traditions. Students of AP World might know that Sufism is a form of Islam that tends to eschew the more rigid hierarchical rules of the religion. And we tend to think of that as a good thing, in part because it allowed a religion to spread much further than it might have. Today, we're going to examine that premise, specifically in the context of South Asia, and we're going to complicate that idea just a little bit. But before we get into that, what do you actually have to know about the spreading of cultural forces in Unit 1.3, that is in South and Southeast Asia? You need to be familiar with Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism, and how their core beliefs and ideas continue to shape society during this time. We'll start off by talking about something called religious equality. Now, Sufism has a lot in common with a movement within Hinduism known as the Bhakti poetry movement, most prevalent between the years 900 to 1500 CE. Very similar to the Sufism desire to be one with God, Bhakti movement poetry emphasized the oneness of the believer with the divine. What a number of historians and scholars and Bhakti poets themselves pointed out was that this desire to be one with the divine superseded any sort of social hierarchy or caste distinction. I don't really want to get into the caste system right now because it's kind of complicated, but the short version is caste is a form of social class and social distinction that has its roots in some Hindu religious texts and has had a presence in the history of South Asia. Perhaps I will do a video at some point that addresses that in more complex detail. But the point here is that the Bhakti movement and the poetry of the Bhakti movement sought to supersede any of those earthly distinctions, if you will. And it is worth noting is that this is also something that was seen in the Christian Protestant Reformation, right? The idea of equality before God, right? Everyone is the same. Princes, paupers, priests, and sinners, we're all equal in the eyes of God. So this concept of wanting to be equal before the divine or equal before God is actually very universal. But let's talk a little bit about it as it relates to South Asia in particular. There are a number of Bhakti poets that were really famous. One of the more well-known ones is Mirabai, who was a woman born to an upper-class family, but she had a religious experience and stepped out of her traditional role as a woman to be one with the god Krishna. Now, it was typical in her time of a woman to stay in the house and perform her duties, be married and have children, but she declared that she was actually already married to Krishna. She then proceeded to write a ton of poetry about this, and her poems have become some of the cornerstones of Bhakti movement poetry ever since. She is famous for saying, quote, "I know only Lord Krishna. He is my father, husband, kin, and none besides." This was a fairly radical declaration. This was a person forsaking all of their familial and social obligations to be one with God. And many paintings that involve Mirabai and Krishna often depict them together as lovers, right? Or perhaps Mirabai performing a song for him, which is a common image you see in a lot of these paintings. Hi there. Post-production, Mr. Little here. I wanted to make a small clarification of something I said during the video. When I talked about Mirabai's decision to renounce her traditional roles in society in the name of pursuing her devotion to the Lord Krishna, while this was a radical step in terms of the Bhakti movement, what I should have done was mention that South Asia does in fact have a long tradition of renunciation, and that is giving up of the world and going to live in a geographically isolated area such as a forest or a mountain. The term for this is sannyasa, and what's interesting about sannyasa versus bhakti, both are Sanskrit words, but sannyasa means renunciation, whereas bhakti means loving devotion. For renunciates, going to live in the forest is to deprive oneself of the sensual pleasures of the world to bring oneself closer to the divine. One particularly famous sannyasa was Siddhartha Gautama, aka the Buddha. He took on the life of a renunciate before he achieved enlightenment. One somewhat distinctive difference between the sannyasa and the Bhakti movement is that in some traditions, the sannyasa is caste limited. Only certain castes are allowed to take up the sannyasa lifestyle. The Bhakti movement is bringing oneself closer to the divine and to the world spirit and sort of losing one's self in the divine or in the universal spirit. So to be clear, the goal of the sannyasa lifestyle and the goal of bhakti devotion is the same thing: to escape a cycle of reincarnation and to become one with the divine. It's just two slightly different ways of going about it. Anyhow, just wanted to clear that up. Now back to the video. Another interesting story is that of Chocomela and the god Vitoba, and I may be mispronouncing that last name. Chocomela was of a lower caste, sometimes referred to as untouchable, and this meant that he was forbidden from entering the temple where Vitoba was worshipped, because the higher caste individuals were afraid that he might pollute the temple or pollute them with his presence. Again, the caste thing is a little complicated. The point of the story is he was forbidden from entering the temple. He was forbidden from entering the temple. However, because of this devotion and desire to enter the temple, which resulted in him being physically whipped in the streets, the god Vitoba actually showed himself to Chocomela, and this sort of revelation resulted in his being allowed to worship at the temple. And he also became a bhakti poet, eventually once writing, quote, "The cause of pollution is the creation of the body. In the beginning, at the end, there is nothing but pollution. No one knows anyone who was born pure." We're all unclean in some respects, so why does one group have the right to keep another group from coming to worship their god because of perceptions of purity or impurity? This emphasis on equality and freedom of choice really does make the Bhakti movement seem like a very egalitarian movement, and in many ways it is. It advocated for spiritual egalitarianism, regardless of caste or social distinction. However, there's another side to this that we're kind of forgetting, and that is we shouldn't necessarily let the fact that these poets and these worshippers were equal in the eyes of their god with being equal in the eyes of the world around them. The scholar Patton Burchett wrote in an article that by admitting that salvation is open to all and that spiritual worth is entirely separate from birth and social class, these poems subtly reinforce the social hierarchy in place, maintaining the social superiority under the guise of egalitarian spirituality. A very fancy way of saying everybody can be equal spiritually, and if that's the case, then we don't have to worry about if everyone's equal on earth. And this is also a critique of the Protestant Reformation in Europe. Martin Luther had advocated for equality of worship, breaking down the Catholic Church's hierarchy. He did not necessarily support equality of people on earth. Martin Luther demonstrated an opposition to earthly equality when he told lords in Germany to put down peasant uprisings. For individuals who believe in the importance of spiritual equality, movements like Sufism, the Bhakti movement, the Protestant Reformation were very important developments, right? Because they do get at that fundamental human nature of believing we all have an equal shot at salvation. That does not necessarily mean that we're all going to be equal in this life right now. So keeping that in mind, when could you use this information? Well, if you're writing any essay about how religions grow and gain followers, how religions influence societies around them, or how different social groups react to new religions or changes in existing religions, then the example of the Bhakti movement, with its emphasis on achieving spiritual equality, but perhaps not making an effort towards earthly equality, would be an excellent way to make your essay a little more complex.